The case discussed in this video has long been surrounded by an air of mystery. Contrary to the usual pattern, each new piece of evidence only added more secrets. By and large, this case was supposed to remain unsolved. However, as it turned out, to solve it, all one needed was to be observant. The story begins in Beaumont, Texas, on September 16, 2010. The phone in room 348 of the Eleganté Hotel kept ringing without stopping. The caller was a woman named Susie Flanagan. Almost every morning, her day started with a phone call to her husband, Greg Flanagan. But this morning was different from the others. For several hours, she couldn't get a response from her husband. Usually, Greg answered instantly, but something was off that day. In addition to this, Greg didn't show up for work at 9 a.m. Of course, this was already a cause for concern. A colleague of Greg's went to the hotel to check on him and informed the manager about the situation. The manager accompanied Greg's colleague to room 348. No one responded to knocks on the door. The manager opened it, and only now did it become clear why there was silence. On the floor of the hotel room lay the body of 55-year-old Greg Flanagan. The arriving medics confirmed the man's death. The detective inspecting the room noted that there was nothing criminal in it. It seemed like there was no struggle. There were no injuries on Greg's body. He lay on the floor, face down, holding a cigarette in his left hand. On the bed were an ashtray, a chocolate bar, and the TV remote. The TV itself was on. The only thing that could be considered strange, albeit reluctantly, was that the air conditioner was turned off despite the sweltering heat in the room. The balcony door was also slightly ajar. Essentially, these were the only things that puzzled the police. By and large, everything suggested that Greg died without anyone's assistance, probably from a heart attack. The man's body was handed over to the medical examiner, and it is from this point that a series of mysteries unfolds in this case. The circumstances of Greg Flanagan's death, initially, seemed unremarkable. On the medic's table lay a 55-year-old man, in good shape for his age. After a systematic examination, the medic found a wound on the left cheek of the man, where his face had touched the floor, and curiously, a laceration between his legs and the groin area. This was already intriguing. The scrotum was swollen, changed in color, and there was a small amount of edematous fluid around the wound. It seemed that Greg received a blow in that area. The story told by his body became more intriguing. When the medic dissected the front part of the torso, abdomen, and chest, he found a considerable amount of blood and extensive internal injuries. The condition of internal organs reflected severe trauma. Greg was beaten to death. The doctor concluded that the trauma to his genitals was likely inflicted by a kick. Additionally, the man received such a powerful blow to the chest that it led to his demise. The only inexplicable aspect was how these injuries left no external signs on Greg's body. Nevertheless, the examination report now stated cause of death, homicide. At this point, let's delve a bit into who the deceased was. Greg was 55 years old, married to a woman named Susie. They had no children. However, it's interesting to note that Susie married Greg twice. The first time was when she was 20 years old and singing in a rock band. When she met Greg, she clearly adored him. They lived in marriage for 5 years. Then, frequent arguments arose between them. Impulsive Susie filed for divorce, and the couple separated. A couple of years after the divorce, Susie dialed Greg's number. As soon as he heard her voice, he said, "Hello, darling, I've been waiting for you to call." It didn't take them long to find themselves back at the altar. From that moment on, their marriage was almost perfect. The only downside for them was frequent separations. Their home was in Lafayette, but due to work, Greg often had to be in other cities. In the past year, Beaumont was one of those cities. Greg spent 5 days a week there and almost always stayed at the Eleganté Hotel. The fact that it was a murder came as a complete surprise to the detective who visited room 348. The door to the room was closed. There were no signs of a struggle inside. Greg's wallet was in the room. Yes, the balcony door was slightly ajar, but it seemed impossible to enter from the street since it was on the 3rd floor. Judging by the injuries Greg had, he must have screamed in pain. However, no one on the floor heard his cries. It appeared that someone opened the door without a key, beat Greg so that he didn't make a single sound, and then left the room without a trace. And most importantly, why? During the investigation, the detective learned that at 7:45 p.m., there was a tripped circuit breaker in Greg's room, causing a power outage. Greg called the hotel manager, and he sent a maintenance worker for repairs. A person named Brian Altris. A person who had a key to the room. The only problem was that the detectives had already interviewed him, and for some reason, he had concealed this information. Of course, it didn't necessarily mean anything, but it was still something. Especially after the detective found out about Brian Altris's past. It turned out that the man had a previous conviction for attempting to assault a roommate. Recall that Greg almost always lived at the Eleganté Hotel. Perhaps Greg attracted Altris, and when he went to Greg's room to fix the circuit breaker, something happened between them. It's possible that the previously convicted employee attempted to make advances towards Greg but faced rejection, leading him to assault Greg. After all, Altris was a very large guy and could easily inflict the injuries Greg suffered. This seemed quite logical, but Brian Altris had successfully passed a lie detector test, which made him less suspicious. Fortunately, by this point, the detectives had another theory. Detectives obtained a call log from Greg's phone. It contained numerous numbers that raised concerns. Specifically, these were numbers of questionable women and even drug dealers. To say that this surprised those who knew Greg is an understatement. People around him knew him as a loving husband, with no inclination towards alcohol, let alone drugs. However, apparently, Greg had another side to him. This shocked Greg's friends, but didn't surprise the detectives. A man spending most of his time away from his wife often resorts to the services of sex workers. A common scenario. Of course, it was unlikely that a sex worker could inflict serious injuries on Greg. But these women usually don't operate alone. They are accompanied by pimps. It's possible that a conflict arose between Greg and a pimp during the payment process, and the pimp assaulted Greg. Each of the phone numbers was checked by the detectives, but none of the individuals to whom these numbers belonged were at the hotel on the night of Greg's death. It was all nonsensical. Everything in this case was completely illogical. Could it be that Greg wasn't the one making those calls? And if not him, then who? It wasn't until a week into the investigation that the police found the answer to this question. It turned out that the federal agency had mistakenly mixed up Greg's printout with the printout of another man, a drug dealer. As a result, the police received incorrect documentation, and it consumed a significant amount of time for the detectives. Greg's correct printout, on the other hand, didn't provide any new clues. All calls were either work-related or related to family matters. In short, nothing unusual. Soon, the leads led nowhere, and the case was archived. Few believed that it would ever be solved. About 6 months after Greg's death, his family hired a private detective, Ken Brennan, a man who had worked in the police force for a long time. This brought a fresh perspective to the case. The police detective who had been handling the investigation prior to this didn't withhold anything from private detective Ken Brennan. Ken gained access to all case materials, and in his understanding, the following scenario unfolded. Around 7:20 p.m., Greg entered the room. He turned on the microwave to heat up food, tripping the circuit breaker. Greg called a worker for repairs. Thus, Brian Altris visited room 348. At 8:30 p.m., Altris fixed the circuit breaker and warned Greg not to turn on the air conditioner while the microwave was running. Due to the scorching heat in Beaumont, it's likely that after Altris left, Greg turned off the air conditioner and succumbed within 15 to 30 minutes, as the air conditioner in the room no longer turned on. Therefore, Greg died around 9 p.m. Now, the focus was on understanding what happened in the room between 8:30 p.m. and 9 p.m. Examining crime scene photos, Private Detective Ken Brennan noticed one detail. The victim was right-handed, but for some reason, the cigarette was in his left hand. This meant that at the time of death, the victim's right hand was occupied with something else, but the question remained with what? Ken speculated that the deceased was probably heading towards the door. Apparently, he wanted to open it with his right hand, but the question remained why? To let someone in or to leave the room himself? Ken, the private detective, interviewed those who were in neighboring rooms that night once again, and after that, he told the police, "I think I know how this guy died, when he died, and who killed him. And I think I know how we can catch them. But first, we need to go back to room 348 and find something." The police officer asked, "But what are we looking for?" Ken replied, "A bullet hole." Returning to the hotel, to room 348, the police and the detective examined the closets, beds, carpet, nightstands, and walls, ultimately finding what they were looking for. In one of the walls, there was a small hole the size of a bullet. This was something new. Ken went to the doctor who conducted the autopsy. The detective told him about the theory of a gunshot wound. The doctor hesitated for a while but eventually admitted that if the bullet had entered the body at the right angle, it could explain the internal injuries. Performing a second autopsy was no longer possible, as Greg's body had been cremated, along with the bullet remaining in it. However, the detective now had a clear picture of what had happened. As mentioned before, there was a hole in the wall resembling a bullet entry point. This wall separated two rooms, 348 and 349. Thus, someone in room 349, for some reason, fired a shot into the wall. The bullet went through it and hit Greg, who was lying on the bed at that moment. It entered at such an angle that the internal organs, ribs, and heart suffered injuries incompatible with life. Greg immediately jumped off the bed and tried to leave the room but couldn't because he died seconds after being hit. The question was, why was this shot fired in the first place? On the night of Greg's death, 3 men were in room 349, 3 electricians, Tim Steinmetz, Lance Mueller, and Trent Pano. The interrogation began with Steinmetz. It had been more than 6 months, so he felt very comfortable. He explained that they were drinking in the room and heard nothing. Detective Ken Brennan asked him to write down his statement on paper and sign it, and Steinmetz complied. Then he asked, "Can I go now?" To which he received the response, "You could have left at any time before signing. Now you're going to jail for perjury because we know you didn't tell everything." At that moment, Steinmetz finally broke and told the truth about that night. On September 15, 2010, Steinmetz, Mueller, and Pano were indeed drinking in room 349. Like the victim Greg, they occasionally stayed at the Eleganté Hotel. One of them, Lance Mueller, had a gun. At some point, he began playing with it and accidentally fired a bullet into the wall. The men heard Greg scream but pretended they had nothing to do with it. They chose not to help him. Instead, they covered the hole with toothpaste. For some reason, none of the hotel staff noticed or paid attention to this hole. After this incident, the men went down to the bar, while Greg was dying in room 348. In the end, in June 2011, Lance Mueller was arrested for the murder of Greg Flanagan. The other two men who were with him that night did not face charges, they were only witnesses. Lance Mueller was a family man with no previous legal issues, but he received a 10-year sentence for the murder of Greg Flanagan. Such a senseless crime that shattered both Greg and Mueller's lives. Perhaps this crime would have remained unsolved if not for the work of a private detective.